I love hearing what people are curious about, even more than I love talking about things I'm curious about. So I do not mind. In fact, I encourage you all at any point in this conversation, if there's something that's not clear or you have a question about it, wave to Clarissa. She'll make sure that I see that you have a question and we'll try to address it in the moment. And I'll just say that any one of my slides could be the basis for an hour-long talk. There's so much. So you may notice that I'm not going into depth in anything, but I'm leaving the door open to you all. If there's some rabbit hole you would like to go down, we can either do it quickly during the presentation or return to it afterwards. I really hope that we'll have some fun questions. So let me see, let me advance my slides. And I feel so badly that this is the first time that the speaker series has been in person since the pandemic. And I'm zooming into you just like the last several years. I would love to be there in person. I just put together a couple of pictures so you could, if I was standing in front of you, you'd have a better sense of the person that I am. But this kind of will give you an idea. I grew up here. I've loved Puget Sound and the Pacific Coast ever since I was old enough to walk and explore the beach. I love my job at Washington Sea Grant. There's so much variety in the sorts of things I get to think about, the problems I get to help tackle, and the partners I get to work with. So it's a little plug for Sea Grant programs everywhere. Many people don't know what Sea Grant is, and it's not that easy to explain unless you are familiar with the land grant, the ag extension model, where there are people who are embedded in a university, usually a land grant university, and they're kind of the go-between between the scientists doing research in agriculture, or in this case, marine science, and then the rest of the residents of the state. And so our job at Sea Grant, just as in ag extension, is to be a two-way street between that science and the users of that information, and make sure that good stuff is getting out to the public, and also the things that the public are interested in get back to the research institution so that we can do useful science. And that is kind of a segue as to why you'll find out why I'm talking to you about kelp farming when my title says carbon specialist, and I came on board Sea Grant 12 years ago to focus on ocean acidification. But I can't see you raise your hands, but I am curious if anyone wants to take a guess. Why is so much of my work focused on kelp and cultivating kelp, when what I'm really concerned about is the causes and consequences of excess carbon dioxide in our ocean? That's the CO2, the carbon dioxide that we people have been putting into the ocean for over 100 years by way of the atmosphere. So if anyone has an idea why kelp is part of this story, feel free to shout it out now or just whisper it to yourself.
Anyone feeling brave? What was that? What was that? Carbon sequestration? Is that what that has to do with kelp?
I would say, yeah, people have been very curious for a while about the potential of kelp to capture some of that excess carbon out of the ocean and put it into a solid form that then we can recover and do something with. So yes, that is it. And I will touch on how I sort of accidentally got into the kelp universe in a slide or two. So next slide. I like to give people a sense of where we're going while we're talking. So this is kind of the flow of the talk. I'm going to start with where I started, which is trying to understand and do something about ocean acidification and address some of the impacts it's having on Washington state people and resources and species. And then that second kind of unfamiliar, perhaps, word, phytoremediation, that's a fancy way of saying using plants to solve a problem. And in this case, we're using not a plant exactly, because seaweeds and kelp are not plants, they're algae, but from a photosynthesis perspective, they do the same thing. So we're using the power of photosynthesis to mediate or try to solve a problem, which is this excess carbon problem. And then I'll talk about how the commercial seaweed sort of craze, and craze is a disservice because there are very, very serious people trying very hard to farm seaweed for very good reasons. But I will say that it really seems to strike a chord with a lot of people. There are people very romanced by the idea of becoming seaweed farmers. And now in my job, I get to talk to a lot of those people and try to help them out. So we'll talk a bit about commercial seaweed farming, and then we'll talk about other restorative seaweed farming, right? I should even have called that seaweed cultivation, because farming implies that you're harvesting something and you're growing it for a purpose. But in restorative seaweed cultivation, what we're trying to do is support wild populations, which are declining in many places. And so the same techniques and the same approaches that are being developed for growing seaweed as a crop are really useful for growing seaweed and other kelps to put back in and try and bolster wild populations. And then I'll give you some food for thought, and then we can get to the Q&A part. You can hear what you're interested in related to seaweed farming and take some of those questions. So there we go. So I came on board Washington Sea Grant like 12 years ago as the national network's first ocean acidification specialist. And my job was to help the residents of Washington try to grapple with this relatively new threat to the well-being of our oceans. But I think I better start by explaining to you all a little bit about what ocean acidification is in the most simple way I possibly can. So I had a grad student at one point who was a beautiful watercolorist, and she made me some paintings that I've found very useful. So in a nutshell, ocean acidification is what happens when the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere naturally dissolves into the ocean and chemically reacts with seawater. So it's that chemical reaction that is actually acidifying the ocean. And for the chemistry fans in the audience, I'll go to the next slide, which there we go. Here's the chemical reaction that is behind ocean acidification. And you can count up those molecules of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. You can see that they're all accounted for when a molecule of carbon dioxide combines with a molecule of water in seawater. And this happens spontaneously. A new molecule, H2CO3, or carbonic acid, is formed. And that's kind of it. We're creating a little bit of extra acid in the ocean, and it's changing the chemical balance of the ocean. It's shifting the pH towards the acidic to become more acidic. It's changing the availability of carbonate ions to living creatures in the ocean who use those carbonate ions kind of like building blocks to build their shells. So things that use carbonate ions to make their shells and hard parts are mollusks like oysters and clams and mussels and corals and a lot of different types of plankton. A lot of species, in fact, about 30% of the species just in Puget Sound are technically calcifiers, things that have hard parts made out of calcium carbonate. And so all of those species are vulnerable to the effects of acidification. And when I say vulnerable, what I mean is that acidification just makes their daily life a little bit harder all the time. It makes it harder for them to form their shells and maintain their shells. And when they have to put extra effort into forming their shells, if they're able to, and they make it past some of these vulnerable life stages, it still takes extra energy. And that's extra energy they then don't get to spend on other important things like reproducing, fighting off disease, hiding from predators. So this ocean acidification really in a nutshell puts extra stress on calcifiers or species that have hard parts made of calcium carbonate. And as we all know, there are multiple stressors in all of our lives. There are other things happening in the ocean environment, like the ocean is getting warmer, habitat is disappearing. So this is just one more straw on an already stressed marine environment. And for some species, it's really kind of too much. So back when I joined Washington Sea Grant, Washington State was just kind of waking up to what was happening in our marine waters and how it was affecting some things that we really care about a lot. And it was noticed initially in the early 2000s in our state's oyster industry. Um, Something I didn't know before I started working in this area is that a lot of the shellfish that we farm commercially in the state are born in hatcheries. They're not, a lot are natural set out in the open waters, but a lot of very big shellfish growers in the state actually have fish tanks on land, hatcheries, where they spawn the oysters and they grow the microscopic baby oysters up to a certain size, and then they plant them out into the tide flats and marine environment. So um, it was in these hatcheries where this bad water chemistry that was occurring more and more frequently because of acidification was first noticed, because the shellfish growers were having complete die-offs of entire crops of baby oysters. And it wasn't until they started working with scientists at the University of Washington and Oregon State and NOAA that they all collectively figured out that it was this increasing acidity that was harming the baby oysters and causing them all to die. And once they figured that out, at least in the hatcheries, they had a way to fix that problem. And it's deceptively simple. What do you do when you have acid stomach and you don't feel very good? You can take some Tums, which is just a way to neutralize that extra acid in your stomach. And so they literally use the same chemicals and they can add them back to the water in these land-based hatcheries and neutralize that acidity. And when they did that, the oyster larvae, the baby larvae or oysters, were just fine. So they kind of solved the problem in the hatcheries. But hatcheries are just one small part of a life stage of a farm shellfish, and it certainly isn't a place where most wild species spend any time. So it really kind of made people start to ask, well, what's happening out in Puget Sound where we can't adjust the seawater? Are things already experiencing impacts from acidification out there? And if they are, what can we do about it? I'm going to just stop here before I go to the next slide and see if anyone has any questions about the basics of ocean acidification or this period 15 to 20 years ago when Washington State was really starting to wake up to this new threat. Okay, hearing none. I will see what's on my next slide because I've already forgotten. Here we go. Right. Okay, so this question of what can we do to maybe mitigate some of this ocean acidification that's happening in Puget Sound and possibly protect species, our shellfish after we plant them out and also other wild species. Governor Christine Gregoire, the governor before Jay Inslee, she was the one who took up the charge to and actually made Washington State a global leader in trying to understand and address ocean acidification. She formed the Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification in 2011, and in 2012, just before she left office, she signed an executive order that said this is going to be a state priority. We're going to put some money behind it. The legislature now funds this research and monitoring for acidification and has for the last 12 years. And also what she encouraged the next governor to do, which he did, was pursue a set of recommendations that the Blue Ribbon Panel had come up with for how to deal with acidification. And one of those recommendations was this idea of phytoremediation. So, and that's using the power of photosynthesis to try to combat ocean acidification. So how would this work? Well, photosynthesis, as I'm sure you remember from your science classes when you were a kid or in college, is the process that was invented billions of years ago on our planet. And it really is one of the most genius ideas that has ever happened on Earth. But it's the process that leverages the power of sunlight to capture and convert CO2, the gas, carbon dioxide gas, either in the air or dissolved in the seawater, into organic biomass, or in other words, living tissue. So plants do it. We all know that's what trees and other plants do on land, but so do algae. And kelp and seaweed are algae. They're macroalgae, big ones that we can see. So they are able to pull carbon dioxide out of their environment and convert it into their own tissue. And we really owe these plants and macroalgae and microorganisms that also do this a huge debt, because the waste product of photosynthesis is the oxygen that we need to live. So not only do plants make us oxygen, but they take care of extra carbon dioxide. So it's pretty useful. And if plants weren't doing this, we would have so much more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and in our oceans right now. The planet would be much, much warmer. So the fact that the excess carbon dioxide we've been emitting for over a century isn't even higher than it already is, part of that is due to photosynthesis by plants. So this is just kind of this is the web page for the state sort of process to deal with ocean acidification. And it's just, to me, kind of a reminder of what it was we were tasked with doing back in the about 2015. And so then there was this experiment. Oh, I should have been showing you this while I was talking about photosynthesis. So here is a representation of a macroalgae, a kelp, a native sugar kelp from the looks of it. And here is those red bubbles are the carbon dioxide entering the seawater. And then this is a close-up look of kelp actually drawing that gas in from the seawater and turning it into tissue. So the idea is, can you get kelp to do the work for us? Can you grow a lot of kelp and see if it draws down carbon dioxide enough to make a dent in acidification and make those surrounding waters more hospitable to some of those shell-forming organisms? So that we did this experiment started in 2015 and concluded in 2019. It was funded by the Paul G. Allen Foundation and the U.S. Navy, and it was conducted in Hood Canal, Washington. And this was the first experiment of its kind in the world. And the idea was basically establish a kelp farm temporarily, 2 years or 2 growing seasons. And we modeled these after kelp farms that were already existing in the East Coast of New England. There was some kelp farming already. And of course, other parts of the world. Asia has been farming kelp for centuries. So we just copied them, and we put a kelp farm in Hood Canal, and then scientists from NOAA and the University of Washington put in all sorts of monitors to try to detect if there was any change in seawater chemistry during the growing season. Was kelp having the desired effect? And sadly, it was not an overwhelming signal. It wasn't. It was very, very hard to detect the reduction of carbon dioxide from these waters. And there are some probably experimental design reasons for that. Here's an obvious one. Kelp likes to grow in fast-moving water. It needs that cold water rushing through it to deliver nutrients constantly. But I kind of liken trying to see whether chemistry was changing as the water moved through the kelp farm to trying to read something on the side of a bus as it's racing by you in downtown. It's very hard to detect changes when they're flowing through the farm and out to sea. So it was difficult to monitor, but if the change had been really dramatic, I think we would have had an easier time to see it. So the conclusion from this experiment is there may be benefits to things that are growing amongst the kelp. They may experience better water quality and less acidification, but this is not the way to solve the world's ocean acidification problem. You just simply can't grow enough kelp to get that job done. And that's a point that I make often. If we have a carbon dioxide problem for sure on this planet, and the number one way that we need to deal with that, you probably know, is to stop putting the carbon dioxide out there in the first place. So we really, really need to steeply cut our emissions. Kelp and other ways of capturing carbon dioxide are not going to, won't be effective tools unless we're also cutting our emissions. So nevertheless, this experiment got a lot of media attention and a lot of folks were really interested in it. The experiment was reproduced on the East Coast by the Bigelow Institute or Lab for Ocean Sciences in Maine. So this is kind of a schematic that they created, and very similar to the experiment that we did. They also included shellfish in their experiment to see, and then they could monitor the shellfish to see if they were healthier as a result of growing. And they do believe they saw some kind of water chemistry, better quality halo around the farm. And they also believe that they saw that the mussels that they were growing were healthier as a result. But this schematic, this little thing off in the corner that said, hey, if you're a shellfish grower and you add kelp to your farm, it's going to be a win-win for you because you can now sell your shellfish and they'll be healthier, and you can sell that seaweed. And I kind of blame this kind of messaging for what happened next. The other thing that I will blame is this guy right here, Bren Smith, who wrote a book around this time called Eat Like a Fish. I can see you out there, so raise your hand if you have seen or read this book. All right, I guess I can't see you out there. But I will tell you that probably 80% of the people who contact me for information about how to become a kelp farmer or a seaweed farmer, in their first few breaths, they'll say, oh, I read this book, Eat Like a Fish, and it changed my world, and this is what I want to devote my life to. So something about farming kelp and Bren Smith's sort of romantic way of describing it really struck a chord in a lot of people. And all of a sudden, I could not keep up. I was supposed to be working on ocean acidification in my job, and I was getting so many calls and emails and requests for information about kelp farming that it ended up becoming a large part of my work plan. It still is. It's about half these days. So I knew nothing about farming kelp. I had to learn alongside everybody else. But my interest in this has always been, can it be a carbon mitigation tool? I mean, a carbon dioxide mitigation tool or a way to address climate change? And if not, are there other reasons we should be growing seaweeds and kelps? So I'm still in the game, obviously, so there must be. Probably if you know anything about seaweed farming, you've heard of at least one of these potential uses. Sometimes I feel there's a great Simpsons episode where I think Homer Simpson holds up a donut and says, is there anything they can't do? And I feel the same way about seaweed because people can't just keep coming up with all sorts of ideas about what seaweeds can be used for should we really get serious about cultivating them. And I'm going to guess that many of you have probably heard about feeding seaweed to cows and the effect that it has on their rumen or the microorganisms that live inside their multiple stomachs. And it causes those microorganisms actually to make a whole lot less methane out of the food that the cows eat. So cows can't digest their food on their own. They are dependent on these microbes that live in their stomachs to help them break down their grass. And one of the waste products of all those microbes, metabolic activity, is methane. And methane is a much, much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And what that means is it traps heat on our planet much more efficiently than carbon dioxide. So the same amount of methane in the atmosphere, or a much smaller amount of methane in the atmosphere, can still really, really contribute to warming on our planet. So addressing this methane production is a big deal and something we have to do. And there is pretty good evidence at this point that cows that are fed a small amount of a couple of species of seaweed, not any seaweed, but a few, it does make them burp less methane. most people don't necessarily know that cows are a pretty big contributor to carbon dioxide and methane in our atmosphere, and they so they're a sizable chunk of climate change right now. So we do need to figure out what to do about our cow habit, and this may be one way of addressing it. Another thing that seaweeds can be used for, and this is they can be used to make bioplastics. You can also extract other things from them and make nutraceuticals, cosmetics, even fiber for clothing. So it really is a very versatile feedstock. This, in the upper right-hand corner, we have a local grown snack. Chicharrones are made right here in Washington by Blue Dot Sea Farms, which is Washington's first commercial seaweed farm. It's actually the farm that hosted that experiment funded by Paul Allen back in 2015. And then after that experiment concluded, they were able to revise their permit and lease with the state to become a commercial farm. And this is their product. And it's kind of like sea Cheetos. And I think they're sold at all the baseball games and downtown and in Whole Foods. And many other places. This picture down here is to represent oil. You can actually make oil out of kelp, and that can be used as fuel. So biofuels is another potential application. And it's well known that seaweeds have a lot of really great micronutrients and other magic ingredients in them that really make terrestrial plants grow. So seaweed is a great fertilizer. And then finally, someone mentioned at the beginning that that connection, my connection to seaweed, which is, can it be used to capture and sequester carbon? My personal opinion, this is not, and this is just me, I'm not representing Washington Sea Grant, anyone else here, is that this is not the best use for cultivated seaweed. It's probably impractical. It's not practical to cultivate enough seaweed to capture the amount of carbon that we do need to capture. And then if we did manage to grow it, where would we put it? People talk about sinking it to the bottom of the ocean. There are some real drawbacks with that. And we could get into that in the questions. But what I do want to emphasize here, that besides the sea Cheetos in the upper right-hand corner, a lot of these potential uses for seaweed are either early in the drawing board process, or there isn't the capacity to produce and sell, and there isn't much of a market for it, at least here in the US. So even though seaweed, it seems like it can do anything, making that actually happen in the US and Washington State has not been easy. Okay, moving on. So there are a really great series of articles came out just in 2024, all published in Civil Eats, and I really encourage you to take a look at these. After this sort of rosy glasses hype phase of seaweed farming will save the world, there was a bit of a reality check. And these are the major barriers to seaweed farming in the US. All of these are true for Washington State. Getting a permit to have a farm in what are basically considered public space, even though quite often the waters and the tidelands underneath them are privately owned or owned by the state or owned by tribes. Getting that permit is very, very difficult. It takes years in Washington State. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time. So that's a huge barrier. I know all 4 Washington State seaweed farmers very, very well. I've been alongside them throughout their journey to becoming commercial farmers, and they have all, at least 3 out of the 4 of them, have faced significant public resistance to their plan to farm. And we can talk about why that is later if you want to ask questions about that. Missing middle, this refers, so many people come to me and ask for help getting established, and they focus on that, getting the permit and getting in the water and getting permission from their communities to do this thing. And they kind of forget that once they have to harvest that there's no place to take their harvest. There's no processing infrastructure. Very, very little, certainly not in Washington state, to convert harvested seaweed into any of those great products. So that's the middle process that doesn't exist for the most part. And then there's the problem that in the US, we're not big seaweed eaters. It's not part of the culture of many of the people who live in our country. And there is not a great demand for seaweed right now, despite what you may read in the media that makes it sound like people are dying to buy seaweed. It's very hard to sell a product. And if you do develop a product like those cicerons, you're going to be competing with established producers and established markets. Asia produces 99% of the cultivated seaweed in the world, and they're very good at it. And they do it at a scale where they can keep their price points quite low. So to succeed in the US as a seaweed farmer, you need to be able to recover your costs and make a small profit. And that's going to require you to charge much more than the same product might be getting sold at and in other parts of the world or in Asian grocery stores here in the States. And so you have to find that niche that will convince people to pay you a lot more for your product. So that's a challenge. And then I really consider the overhyping of seaweed as kind of a silver bullet for everything as a barrier, because that kind of messaging will always come back to bite you. You know, what if it turns out not to be true, that seaweed can't fix climate change? Then people are going to kind of lose faith in it. And I see that as a kind of a risky way to try and develop a new market. I believe giving people a straight story is more likely to help. All right. So what I try to do at Washington Sea Grant took several years, but I now coordinate a community of practice. This is open to anyone who is seriously interested in seaweed farming, seaweed cultivation, not necessarily becoming one, but if you see yourself as someone who has a stake in the development of seaweed cultivation in Washington, this community is open to you. All what happens, you write to me. My email address will be at the end of this talk. I will add you to our mailing list. You'll get invitations to quarterly online meetings that are open to all, and they're very education focused, but they're also focused on maintaining this network of people who are interested in, concerned about, want to help shape seaweed cultivation in Washington state. You'll also get a newsletter, really great newsletter, 4 or 5 times a year. And you can also come to my monthly seaweed office hours and you can just ask whatever you want. We'll just talk for an hour about seaweed. So that's how I try to support informed cultivation of seaweed for commercial, but also environmental and cultural purposes. I will say that Washington Sea Grant, we don't have an agenda. We are trying to provide information so you all can make informed decisions about what you want to have happen. So we're not advocating for seaweed farming, but we're not advocating against seaweed farming. And if anyone comes to us wanting information about it, we will provide it without, to the best of my ability, bias. All right. Here's the sum total of Washington State's seaweed farming industry. I'm especially thrilled. As I said, I know all of these folks very well, so I consider them friends, and I'm happy for their success. They're good people, and they've been working hard. So this Vashon kelp forest right here just got the go-ahead from the state to start farming last week after about a 3-year process. So we have Lummi Island sea greens way, way up in Lummi Island and deep in Lego Bay, Blue Dot Sea Farms at the very north end of Hood Canal. And then these 2 farms in King County at the south and north end of Colvos Passage on the west side of Vashon Island, respectively. So there are their email addresses their URLs, and they have great websites, and I encourage you to take a look. And I know that we are probably coming up to time. Got 5 minutes. Okay, so I've told you about why people want to be commercial seaweed farmers. I alluded to why I think we shouldn't, a reason why we shouldn't cultivate seaweed. I don't think we should be cultivating it as a way to capture and sequester carbon and seaweed our way out of the climate crisis. I only feel that way because I don't think it's going to work. And I don't think we can afford to follow any red herrings at this point as we try to figure out what we're going to do to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I'm kind of down on seaweed farming if that's the reason you're doing it, because frankly, personally, I think it's might be a waste of time. But there are so many other reasons to cultivate seaweed, both commercially and as in that restorative aquaculture sort of way. And so this slide kind of summarizes some of the incredibly important roles that seaweed and kelps. By the way, I never said that kelp and seaweed are kind of synonymous. All kelp are seaweed, but not all seaweed is kelp. Kelp is kind of the large forest forming version of seaweeds. So sorry I didn't say that earlier. But both kelp and seaweed play such important roles in our ecosystem. We really can't have a healthy marine environment without these amazing macroalgae. So I encourage you to both check out the Northwest Straits Instagram feed, where they have been doing a wonderful campaign about all the reasons to protect and restore kelp. And also check out the Puget Sound Restoration Fund's amazing story map called Exploring Puget Sound's Kelp Forests. And I know nobody can write down that awful URL at the bottom. I know it. Anybody who wants these links, you can write to me afterwards. I'll share my whole presentation with you. It will be recorded. Maybe I'll even get around to making a document with all the links to make it easy for you all. So point of this slide here is, yes, we should be cultivating seaweed to help bolster disappearing populations. And if you haven't heard, our kelp forests in parts of Washington state and throughout the West Coast and around the world are really suffering. They're suffering most likely from climate change. These are cold water macroalgae, and as the ocean warms, that extra heat puts a stress on them, just the way we all feel extra stressed when it's 115 degrees outside. So as the waters are warming, that's hard on kelp. There are probably many other reasons, most of them, I would say, related to human activities, why kelp is suffering, kelp forests are suffering around the world. And so restoring them is really, really important. Figuring out what's harming them, trying to address that, and then trying to cultivate them and put these species back is incredibly important. And I can't think of anybody else in the world that's better than at doing this than the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. I'm very proud that this wonderful organization was born in Washington state, and I'm proud of the great work that they're doing. They cultivate a number of species. Kelp is just one of them, but they're focused on iconic, ecologically critical species that are in decline in Washington waters and propagating them in hatcheries and putting them back in. And they're doing this in an extremely responsible way with a lot of attention paid to genetics and ecosystem services. And another thing that they do so well is partner with indigenous people, native tribes in Washington state, for whom kelp is an incredibly important resource and always has been. So I encourage you to go to the Puget Sound Restoration Fund's website, just restorationfund.org, and then look at some of their programs, like their bull kelp program, and see what they're doing and see some of the wonderful films and story maps and other products that they've created to help people understand what's going on and how they can help. As I said, Restoration Fund is a terrific partner to tribes who are also leading their own efforts to steward and restore our critical kelp beds in the state. Here are just three examples, two of them quite recent. News stories about what tribes, in this case, the Samish tribe in North Puget Sound and the Squaxin Island tribe in down near where you are, they are both doing things to try to restore the health of the beds that they depend on. And then this beautiful picture, some of you who have visited Point Defiance Park, not Point Defiance, Deception Pass Park may have seen this wonderful wood carving that tells the story of a Samish Indian maiden who actually married an undersea man. He kind of tricked her. She went to live with him in exchange for providing him, guaranteeing food and resources for her people. And as she lived with him, her hair turned into kelp, and you can see this bull kelp rippling down over her shoulders. It's a wonderful story, and you can read all about it in the one of the appendices to the Washington State Kelp Plan, which talks about the cultural importance of kelp to Indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest. And it's not just the Puget Sound Restoration Fund and tribes who are really rallying to support and restore our kelp. We've got nonprofit organizations like the Northwest Straits Commission that has been central to developing the kelp plan. That's the nickname for this plan to understand and restore kelp in Washington. It's also the state Department of Natural Resources devotes a lot of energy to monitoring and stewarding, our kelp resources. Sorry, I can maybe go back to that. Nope, can't quite. Yeah, I can. So great work happening at Department of Natural Resources as well, and a lot of really important research. So getting close to the end, I cannot recommend this beautiful website highly enough. And it's got a super memorable URL. You don't even have to write it down. It's just called Bull Kelp Info. This is the brainchild of a super creative artist, Josie Islin, and her sort of science partner, Maureen Teuschel, I believe. And it is the most captivating online resource for understanding the importance of kelp to West Coast cultures and ecosystems. And it's so interactive, and you can spend hours in here. So really encourage people, if you haven't already become a fan of kelp, this will do it to you. So take a look at it. And here's another thing that might be really fun to watch. An Oregon State University student made a really nice film, really focusing on work that's happening in Oregon and Washington State to restore our native kelp beds. And yours truly has a little cameo, but so do a lot of people who are doing really, really important work. And you will enjoy watching this video if you get a chance. I think I'm almost to the end. This screenshot was just too good not to put in. Again, it's a product of the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, part of their Eyes on Kelp program, which is focused on monitoring the health of kelp. So if you go to this page, you can really explore this, I think, pretty creative collection of ideas for what you can do as depending on what type of person you are. And you can be many of these things at the same time, but it goes beyond just the take your reusable bags to the grocery store sort of advice. It gives, I think, some really thoughtful ideas for how each of us actually can contribute to the health of the marine environment, and specifically kelp in Washington State. So hope you'll have time to take a look at that. And I bet I'm done. Probably almost on time. And I found this great t-shirt up at the Vancouver Aquarium. I could not resist. And so it's become one of my looks when I'm doing this work. So I'll stop talking. You can bring up the lights. I can't wait to hear what I didn't cover well enough or forgot to talk about, and take some of your questions. Thanks for being a great audience.
We're getting those lights turned on, but got a question up here.
Thanks. What species are primarily being grown or proposed to be grown in the Puget Sound? And is
Okay.
it different South Sound versus North Sound?
Well, so commercially cultivated, and as far south as that goes is the southern tip of Vashon Island. So I don't consider that South Sound myself. By the way, I grew up on Vashon, so I feel like I can say that. The species that are cultivated here are primarily sugar kelp, and that's a native species. You'll see it when you're walking on the beach if you're near an understory kelp bed. It's the same species that's cultivated in New England. It's also native to the Atlantic. It's quite a cosmopolitan species, and it's kind of grown here because that's the kind of kelp people knew how to grow. It's not necessarily the best kelp to grow or the kelp people like to eat the most, but it's kind of what we know how to do here. So that kind of becomes the default species for new farmers. But that farm at the north end of Vashon that was just, well, they got their permit, but they also just received their lease from Department of Natural Resources to start farming. They are going to cultivate bull kelp. And they're a very interesting farm. That's the Vashon Kelp Forest Project. And they're only kind of a farm because they're half focused on restoration. They are quite serious about not harvesting. They're going to grow bull kelp and not harvest it. They're going to hope that the bull kelp that they cultivate actually naturally reseeds nearby beds that are declining. So it's farmish. They may start cultivating some bull kelp for harvest, and they may start cultivating some sugar kelp as well. But they are the only ones right now who are focused on cultivating bull kelp in Washington specifically for restoration. But they do reserve the right to do some commercial harvest as well. There's so many more species. I could have showed a slide with beautiful drawings of dozens of species of kelp that can be cultivated that are native to this area that just aren't, because we don't have that know-how yet.
Over here in the back.
Couple of questions. The permitting process is hard for commercial farmers, but for restorative farmers and for private landowners, I mean, is it easier for those people? Is it easier to just go out and like put some kelp on your seashore? Is that harder, or is that something that also take 2 or 3 years to do?
Okay, so that's question number one. Ask your second one, then I'll start talking.
I'm curious about the bioplastics. It was mentioned as a use. It seems like the sticking point or the rate limiting step right now is the utilization of the product. And I'm curious how much you know about bioplastics and how that has been used and how effective that is.
Okay. All right. So first question, right now, projects cultivating kelp for restoration purposes, it is pretty much as hard to get permits to do that as it is to get a farm. They basically have to go through all the same hoops. And before, I want to stop and say that these permitting processes are long and detailed for a reason. It's important to regulate these things. Back in the old days when anybody could just bring a species into Puget Sound and do whatever they wanted with it, that's how we ended up with some species that aren't native to this area really taking root. Not in the seaweed world, but for example, our beloved Pacific oysters. Those aren't from here. They are from Japan. They were brought here specifically to be cultivated, but they are now kind of with us for better or for worse, and they have crowded out some native shellfish. So it's important to really think about the implications of any project, and that's what the permitting process is all about. That said, it's a long, slow process because the people who are charged with reviewing these proposals and these ideas, farming kelp is new to them also. And so it takes them longer to consider the ramifications of a project. I'll also say that the planners, the county planners, the various state agencies and the tribes, they already have a lot on their desks. They have a lot of things going on. And so it takes a lot of time to review and think about permits. And so you're asking people who already kind of have full inboxes to take on another thing. So those are some of the reasons why permitting is slow in Washington. However, your question is about private landowners or restoration operations, right now, you would have to go through the same sorts of permitting process. People are well aware that this doesn't really make sense and have been talking with the state and the other entities that are involved in permitting to try and create a separate track for this sort of thing. And the Puget Sound Restoration Fund is actually kind of figured out a potential loophole that would allow private landowners to do a little bit of gardening. They're going to call it kelp gardening on their own intertidal waters without having to get a permit. And that's something that they've been working very transparently with the state. They're not trying to be sneaky, but they are trying to point out how it is possible to maybe make it easier for private landowners to do a little bit of restoration on their own land without having to go through this very difficult process. And I'm really looking forward to that, hopefully coming to fruition in the next year or so. Trying to think, they're not quite ready to be public. I mean, it's not a secret, but they're not quite ready to like roll out this how to become a kelp gardener manual, but I think they will be soon. And I'll just, I don't want to tease you too much, but one of the techniques that they're trying to develop that I just think is so creative and very cool is taking the baby kelps, which are microscopic practically. They're called sporophytes. You grow them in a hatchery the same way you would grow shellfish in a hatchery, and embedding these little tiny microscopic baby kelp plants in kind of a natural jello, and then painting that jello on rocks that you would pick up from your own beach. And this jello kind of hardens really fast, so you can paint the goo on to a rock from your beach, wait 10 minutes, put the rock back, and then see if the baby kelps can start growing out of that rock. That avoids one big hurdle in the permitting process, which if you're ever putting infrastructure in the water, there's a lot of regulation around that. So putting in anchors and buoys and lines, all the things you do for a kelp farm, that's all really regulated. But if you're painting a rock from your own beach and just putting it back, that's not infrastructure. And so that's a, I think, very creative way to address some of these hurdles that are part of the permitting process. So that was question number one. And let me see if I can remember number two. Is bioplastics. I'm not enough of a chemist to really tell you what to have an informed opinion, I think, about the plastics themselves. But I do know that there are a couple of going concerns, commercial businesses. I think at least one of them is in California, and it's called Sway, SWAY. And they must have found the processing facilities that they needed to do this sort of thing down there, and they are making bioplastics out of kelp. And of course, people trying to do this, they tend to be motivated by wanting greener alternatives to our very non-green, oil-based plastics. And so making sure that these kelp-based plastics are also biodegradable is part of their business plan. So I think that's another good thing about this generation of kelp seaweed plastics that's coming up, is that you don't require fossil fuels to make them, and they degrade. But I can't really tell you much more about it than that. But I am just remembering that someone in Washington just invented another really cool thing to do with seaweed. And I can't remember the name of the company. It might be Ocean Made. They're making planter pots out of seaweed. So these could be used in the commercial horticulture industry. So rather than having a plastic pot, you have a pot that is made of seaweed, biodegrades, contains some of those really growth stimulating components that seaweed has. So the plant actually gets a benefit from this pot that it's growing in, and you can put the whole thing in your garden and it decomposes. You don't have plants that are root bound. I think it's genius. I think that is just about ready to be commercialized also. If you email me later, I will be able to look up the link. I saw them recently on LinkedIn, and I could send you some information about that cool company.
Thank you. Email's already sent.
Great. Oh, cool.
Did you have a question?
Yes, I wonder whether you could explain how the sea otters specifically are dependent on the kelp forests. And if our kelp forests are in decline, whether that's affecting the sea otter population.
Boy, the kelp sea otter situation, that is so complex. It's a fascinating story, and there's so many perspectives on it, some of which will, maybe surprise you because, well, I'll just say that you probably have heard about the kelp forest being consumed by urchins on the West Coast, and the kelp forests that have disappeared in the last couple of years, probably due to marine heat waves, aren't able to come back because the urchins are just waiting. Urchins love to eat kelp, and they just nibble to death every little kelp stub that tries to regrow. And people have proposed bringing in the sea otters to eat the urchins so that the urchins won't eat the kelp, and then the kelp will regrow. And it sounds easy, but it's very complex. And there are even people who are like, we don't want sea otters around here, because sea otters also eat the other things that we like abalone and other forms of shellfish. So, but to try to actually answer your question, Washington State now has sea otters on our Pacific coast, the outer coast. We have some sea otters that live in kelp habitat in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so along our northern shores there. And by the way, right now in Washington, our native kelp on our coast and along the Strait of Juan de Fuca are doing relatively well. The absolute decimation of kelp beds that have happened in California and up the West Coast hasn't quite reached into our state yet. So we have healthy kelp beds, although I have heard from many tribal elders on our outer coast who say the kelp is nothing like it was when they were young. But we have relatively healthy kelp beds, and we don't have a sea urchin problem right now, and we have some sea otters there. We don't have sea otters in Puget Sound, except for one really weird lost sea otter who has found his way into South Sound. People are very surprised. He has a nickname. He's a young juvenile male. He's all by himself down there. That is a part of Puget Sound that has experienced really, really steep bull kelp declines. For example, the Squaxin Island tribal waters around their reservation. That's where a historically robust bed has now dwindled to a few bull kelp stipes, and that's it. And that is a focus of restoration by that tribe and the Puget Sound Restoration Fund and other people working on the problem. But right now, Washington, we don't really have that clash between trying to restore our kelp beds and sea otters. But you also asked, like, how do sea otters use kelp? You've probably seen the unbearably cute pictures of sea otters like wrapping themselves and their babies up in kelp and then taking a snooze. And that's what they use it for. They use it to raft together. They eat the things that eat kelp. So it's both food and lodging for sea otters. So they really, really rely on these kelp environments. I don't know if sea otters can do well in the absence of kelp. It's a good question. I probably didn't fully answer your question at all. Is there anything you'd like to ask me to explain further or guess about further?
Well, thank you. That's more information than I had, so that's very helpful.
Okay. That Bull Kelp Info website, the beautiful story map, has so much information about otters and does a good job, I think, about addressing that complexity. So I know you'll find some really interesting stuff if you look at that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the way that most of these farms are set up, particularly since it's mostly sugar kelp that's out there, or only sugar kelp that's out there right now. It looked like it was all hanging from ropes, kind of the way that sometimes you cultivate oysters. What, has anybody been looking at sort of the infaunal community of the intertidal, where these things are going in, you know, what the actual disturbance is to the seabed, and then how long it's taking to repopulate once the farm is in, and what is repopulating?
Yeah, I would say that asking those questions and trying to get some answers is part of the permitting process for each of the farms. This permitting process is pretty rigorous. They have criteria for either trying to avoid any kind of significant ecosystem impacts, or if you can demonstrate that there are ecosystem impacts from a proposed project, then you have to have a plan for mitigating those somehow. So yes, people have really been paying attention to sort of trying to anticipate in advance, putting something in the water, what might be the impacts? Could it change sort of the energy of the waves on a shoreline, for better or for worse? Could it help species, particularly like invasive species, sort of hopscotch through Puget Sound? Could they get a ride on kelp? That's another concern I've heard. Kelp that's cultivated. What is the impact on the bottom of setting these anchors? Another really big concern that comes up often is, what are the effects on marine mammals of putting these lines in the water? Like you noticed, these lines are submerged. Sugar kelp it's not a floating canopy kelp like bull kelp. It is naturally sort of a neutrally buoyant kelp. The technical term for that is prostate kelp, and sort of like floats. It just kind of drifts neutrally from the lines where it's grown a couple of meters below the surface. So given that it's not visible from the surface, it's not as easy to monitor what's going on around it. People are really concerned about, well, what happens if animals try to interact with that? All I can say really is that these are things that people consider a lot when they're permitting. When you get a lease from the state, when you get your permit, continued monitoring and adaptive management, which means if something is not working well, you do something about it. That's part of the arrangement. That's part of the contract with the state. And the leases that have been granted to Washington's handful of seaweed farmers they're not like the leases that a shellfish farmer might get that have a term of like 9 to 12 years. The seaweed farm leases tend to be very short, so that the state can like keep a close eye on what's going on. And when I say the state, there are scientists who work for the state as well as managers and regulators. So a lot of people are watching, and they have these short-term leases to make sure that if this doesn't look like it's going to be a good idea, they have an opportunity to not renew that lease in a relatively short, like 3 to 4 year period. If that final video that I put up, the Vimeo, there's some really good footage of what kinds of critters tend to be attracted to cultivated kelp. There's all these little crustaceans native that are practically blanketing the kelp lines because they feed on the kelp. And then other fish and things come in and eat them. And then there's scientific research, there's published papers about impacts, positive and negative. It's kind of a burning question in the kelp cultivation community on species. And I think that I can tell you that there have been no instances in 40 years of marine mammals getting entangled or being harmed by the type of gear that's used to cultivate sugar kelp in the United States. So that sounds very specific, but yes, marine mammals can get tangled in things for sure. And marine mammals get tangled a lot, sometimes fatally, in fishing gear, crab pot gear. Crab pots tend to have a buoy at the top, and then they have their crab pot at the bottom. They're not weighted, they're not anchored, they drift, they get lost. Those present serious hazards, and we have lots of examples, unfortunately, of mammals getting entangled in that gear. Kelp, seaweed, at least sugar kelp farming gear, and bulk kelp hopefully also. Just the way it's set up, the lines are kept very, very taut. They're horizontal rather than vertical. And a lot of people think that it's really not going to pose a risk. It would be, a mammal would have to work really hard to get tangled up in that. It wouldn't happen by accident. It's incumbent on the shellfish growers to make sure that their gear is intact, check it after, I mean, seaweed farmers, check it after storms, make sure everything is always ship shape, so to speak. But if they do that, there's a lot of confidence within NOAA, which is the federal agency that's charged with making sure things are done right in the ocean. There's a lot of confidence that this type of gear is not a threat to mammals. There is a lot of open questions about what the impacts of seaweed farming are, and it's kind of a catch-22 situation. We can have ideas about what might happen. Could cultivated species that, are kind of like a strain of kelp, can that affect the genetics of nearby wild kelps? We can't really answer that question until we get a chance to do the experiment in the open water. And I am happy to say that the few farms that exist right now in Washington, all 4 of them are bending over backwards, are encouraging scientists to come in and do those experiments in at their sites. They want to know the answers as much as anybody else. And I would say that they're all right now really good partners for the researchers who want to answer those questions.
Very informative. Nice. Did I answer all the questions?
I tend to think more about invertebrates and infaunal invertebrates in particular, but if there's general interest from the current farmers to have scientists in there, I'm sure there's data out there. It would just be a matter of finding it. Yeah.
Well, the experiments are starting. You have to have these farms in the water. So the farm on the south end of Vashon put in its gear in November and is out planting its first crop of sugar kelp right now. The farm on the north end that has bulk kelp, they just got their lease. I don't know if it's too late for them to start doing things, but what's cool now that they know that they're going to be a farm, now they can invite in their research collaborators to come in and try to characterize their site before the gear goes in. So you can really, get asked those questions. What is the change? You can't monitor change unless you can start to look at a before and an after and a during. So the farm on the north end might be a really great opportunity to get a sense of what does change when you put in this gear. What does recovery look like? There's a lot. If you go to the Pacific Sea Farms website, that's the southernmost farm on Vashon. Mike Spranger, he's the co-founder of that. He's out there on the water or in the water, probably 5 days a week. And he had a lot of time while he was waiting for his permits and his lease to be finalized. And he loves to dive and make movies. And he bought a drone, an underwater drone. There's so much footage of his farm from the surface and below the surface that you can look at and kind of get a sense of what's there and what it looks like now that there's a couple of concrete blocks. You can see them actually deploying these big anchors for their farm. An important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this footage is just like a deciduous forest on land, depending on the time of year, it's going to look really different. Seaweeds are a lot of the kelps are annuals. They reseed and grow and become huge during the growing season, and then really senesce and shrivel back and become almost nothing during the winter. So you can look at a place that can be smothered in kelps, native sugar kelp and other understories during the spring and summer. And if you dive there during the winter, it'll look like rocks. So keep that in mind as you're looking at footage. And it's also important for the regulators to think about that too, as they're reviewing sort of information that prospective farmers are showing them. They should be asking those prospective farmers, like, I want to see what's there in June so that we can think about what might be displaced by your structure. But I will tell you, anybody who has a boat with an anchor. I don't know if anybody out there has a boat on an anchor, but if you do, my parents had a sailboat with an anchor, and you would have to dive and clean off the chain constantly because it would get coated with kelps. They grow very well. You give them a surface to grow on and they will grow. So to me, and I fully expect that the concrete anchor blocks that Pacific Sea Farms deployed this fall will be coated with their own kelp this summer. And that's new substrate. That's new habitat. Places where the kelp wasn't able to grow before, it now has some blocks and chains to attach to and grow from. So it's always a complex answer. You can't say, oh, this infrastructure will be harmful. Sometimes the infrastructure is actually like even oil rigs. I saw a National Geographic article recently about, look what's growing all over decommissioned oil rigs, and it's true. Species love new habitat. Excuse me.
Well, thank you so much, Meg, for braving your sickness and still presenting for us tonight.
Yeah, happy to. I'm really sorry I couldn't. I'm glad I'm not infecting you all. Thank you for coming.